person you would have thought would have done something like this.
Something like that had never happened here before.
That's one thing you never forget. Something like that you never think would happen or you'd come upon. And it stuck with me for a long time.
Westfield, New Jersey is a town 15 miles outside of New York City, United States, which is located 16 miles southwest of Manhattan. In our modern time, Westfield is described as the perfect mix of classic and modern, and this might just make it the best downtown in New Jersey. Nevertheless, something dark, violent and gruesome would happen in this town that shook everyone around and sent shockwaves all over the country. But before I get into this story, if you're a lover of unusually disturbing, dark and spooky contents presented narratively, you might consider subscribing, do turn on post notifications for daily to weekly content uploads, and proceed to give the like button a special treat to your favorite ice cream shop. And with that said, let's get into today's story. During the fall on December 7th of 1971, the police attention were called to a mansion for welfare check. This was because the reclusive family that lived in this estate had not been seen for a while. Due to the nature of this family, this was not unusual, as there weren't people who socialized much with others around them. The lights in this mansion remained on all throughout this time period, both during the day and also at night, but with no visible sign of movement in and out of this particular mansion. However, neighbors began to suspect something was wrong when one after another, the lights began to burn out. Few minutes later, the police would arrive to the mansion and would try to look inside the house through the windows, but they could see nothing because everywhere was dark. All the doors had been locked and no response from any of the residents inside the mansion could be heard. But luckily, while the police officers were still searching for a way in, an unlocked window was found and an officer began to make his way inside the house. As the officers began to navigate their way from the dark basement through this large mansion, icy cold air blasted from the air conditioners and classical gospel music echoed through the darkness on the intercom system of this mansion. The house otherwise was still and still. A repulsive odor hung in the air as the officers began to cover their noses while making their way through this large house, looking for the occupants. However, when they reached the ballroom, they saw people lying on the floor and appeared to be sleeping inside sleeping bags with their faces covered. The police officers called out several times to these individuals and said to them, "This is the Westfield police," and whether they did mind getting up from their sleeping bags. After they had asked this question, then they waited, but no one responded. So on getting closer, they opened the sleeping bags and uncovered their faces, and what they saw shocked and horrified them. This was also when they discovered the source of the repulsive odor they first perceived when they initially entered the house. Immediately, the officers would call for backup and the search began inside the house to know if there was more people still hiding as unknown suspects or perpetrators of what they had just discovered within the house, or to know if there was a person or more people who made the same fate similar to what they saw at the ballroom of this mansion. Few minutes later, backup arrived, and within 45 minutes of searching and combing through the entire house, right on the third floor, another grisly discovery was made, which made the police officers and everyone around to begin to question themselves. What just happened? Although they didn't have to ask for long, because in one of those rooms inside the house, they saw a written note detailing the confessions of what had been done. But it didn't answer the question, why did it happen? This would also lead to a manhunt that lasted for almost 2 decades. 2,000 miles away from Westfield, New Jersey, in early 1972 was a town in western United States known as Denver. A 46-year-old man by the name of Robert Peter Clark was working as an accountant in Denver, Colorado. Robert lived a normal life and was free from much of life stress and seemed all happy. This had been a life he always wanted. Robert would later go on to fall in love with a woman he met at one of the religious gatherings. Her name was Dolores Miller. In 1985, they got married, and 3 years later, in February 1988, they moved from Denver to Richmond, Virginia. There, he got another job within an accounting firm and was living his desired life, a normal, quiet and private life free from challenges and poverty. This has been a life he had always dreamed of. In 1988, which was 15 years after the police made a gruesome discovery back in Westfield, New Jersey, a new national television show began to catch the attention of the public. The name of the show was America's Most Wanted, and the Westfield police authorities decided to leverage on the success of this show to carry out their investigation on what happened within the mansion. They contacted America's Most Wanted and asked them to take over the investigation, but they refused. However, the authorities were very far from giving up. They pestered them until they agreed 9 months later, which was in April 1989. The host of the show, by the name of John Walsh, employed a man with an extraordinary talent known as Frank Bender. Frank had a unique set of skills as a forensic artist. He could sculpture an artistic bust that could show what a person would look like as they grew older. This man could also recreate a person's decayed remains, showing how they would appear now or how they appeared at some certain stage in their life. And this was a time when machines and technologies that could automatically generate an older version of a person has not been introduced or invented yet. The show would later go on to recount the events that took place back in 1971 while featuring the sculptured work of the supposed suspect. However, things would change on May 1989, which was a month after the show America Most Wanted agreed to help the police authorities in Westfield in their pursuit for answers by appealing to the citizens to call to their office and help identify through the sculpture where the suspect might be, or whether they had seen or spotted the suspect at any point in time. Out of hundreds of calls to this show trying to help find answers of what happened in that mansion back in 1971, one call stood out, and this was the beginning of a break in this case and would be the first step in answering that question of why that happened back in 1971. This call came from Denver, and the caller claimed to be Robert Clark's next door neighbor from Denver, Colorado, before he moved to Richmond, Virginia, and the FBI was contacted immediately. 11 days later, on June 1st, 1989, after a tip had been made to the show claiming to know who a 63-year-old Robert Clark was, federal agents would visit the home of Robert at Richmond while he was still at work. His wife Dolores, who was still at home, insisted that Robert Clark, her husband, wasn't capable of the accusation being put against him. She, however, directed them to his accounting office where he was working. On arriving at his office, 2 FBI agents would approach Robert Clark and ask him, "Are you Bob Clark?" To which he replied, "Yes." The agent now asked again, "Are you John List?" And the man replied, "No, I am Bob Clark," to help discover his real identity and potentially let him go, or maybe not. He was asked to come to the police headquarters where his fingerprint was taken and compared to that of another individual's fingerprint. The result came out, and it was a match. It was discovered that indeed he wasn't Robert Clark, because his real full name was John Emil List. On June 29, 1989, he was extradited from Richmond, Virginia to Westfield, New Jersey. And this was John List's story.
The oldest we've ever pursued on America's Most Wanted.
Devastated. We didn't think anything happened in Westfield, especially a crime like that.
Oh, he's not going to heaven. I know for sure that this man is not going to heaven.
Is beyond comprehension.
John List was born on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan. He was the only child of German-American parents, John Frederick List, who was his father, and Alma Barbara Florence List, who was his mother. They were devout Lutherans, and his father was also a Sunday school teacher. And just like his father, John Emil List took after his father in being so religious. To know how religious they were, you should know a little about Lutherans. Lutherans believe that mankind are saved only by the grace of God and not by our actions or whatever we do. They also believe that the salvation of mankind is through faith alone, hence we only need to trust in God. Lutherans also believe that the Bible, also referred to as the Scripture, is the only true standard for faith and life by which the teachings of God are to be judged. In 1943, Jean would go on to graduate from Bay City Central High School, which was a year before his father died, and he would later enlist in the US Army, where he served as a laboratory technician for the US military. In 1946, Jean would be discharged from the military and would enroll at the University of Michigan, where he earned his bachelor's degree in business administration, and he also obtained his master's degree in accounting. In November 1950, Jean would be recalled to serve in the military during the Korean War. In Virginia, while serving, he met a woman by the name of Helen Morris Taylor, who was a widow with a daughter called Brenda. Her husband had been killed in Korea during the war. Jean would later go on to marry Helen on December 1st, 1951. In 1952, John List would work for an accounting firm in Detroit, and by 1959, he would go on to have his 3 kids, Patricia, Jean Jr., and Frederick. He would also later be promoted as the general supervisor of the accounting department. In 1960, Helen's first daughter from her first marriage, by the name Brenda, married and left the List household, while List moved with his family to Rochester, New York, where he got a job with a company known as Xerox, and there he rose through the ranks as a senior accountant to become the director of the accounting service department. By 1965, he became the vice president of a bank in New Jersey. By all accounts, Jean seemed to be doing pretty well. The family appeared to be the picture of the American dream. The List family were very close to one another and were also devoutly religious family of Lutherans, attending church each Sunday. John also did serve as a Sunday school teacher, just like his father. With the help of his mother Alma, John and Helen would purchase their dream family house, but on the condition that she, Alma, would live together with John and his own family. John would later go on to purchase a lavish 19-room Victorian home called Brisnall for his family, and this mansion was said to be the most expensive house in the Westfield neighborhood of New Jersey as of that time. John did care and provided for his family until one day, at the age of 46, he lost his job where he was laid off after the Jersey City Bank was closed in 1971. After John lost his job, no matter what he tried, he was unable to secure another job and even refused steadfastly to accept any sort of welfare from the government. This was because John's father had instilled in him strict standards of self-reliance, and John did live by this principle. He believed that no matter what, he should be able to stand on his own. John also did believe that poverty was a sin, hence he did not tell anyone about his condition, not even his family, about what happened, as that was too humiliating for him. When no other jobs were coming his way, even after so many interviews, he began a pattern that mimicked his daily schedule of going to work. He would bath, dress up, have his breakfast with his family at the dining table, leave the house by early morning, and go to the train station where he would read the newspaper to pass time. Then he would return home at night as though nothing was wrong. This he did for 6 months. He couldn't bear to tell his family of their current predicament, so he began to take money from his mother's bank account to pay for his mortgage. He even encouraged his children to get part-time jobs, telling them that it was to show maturity and responsibility, while in the real truth, it was all a shred so that his family could remain just afloat above their current predicament. Jean fell deeper into debt as he couldn't pay for his mortgage. His family expenses were rising as his children were growing up fast. Also, his wife Helen started skipping church and began to spend more money than was earned as she became heavily dependent on alcohol and drugs like antidepressants and sought the help of psychiatrists. However, more money was being spent than earned, and this drove John further into despair as more responsibilities fell on his shoulders. After much thought and deliberation on 2 options, the first of which was either to accept welfare from the government, and this was already against John's religious beliefs as a Lutheran, or the second option, which was to kill his entire family and send their souls to heaven. He did his calculations, arrived at a solution to his problems and decided to take action. And this was what happened. On the early morning of November 9th, 1971, which was a month before the police came searching and finally managed to enter the house, John Lees did something horrific and unexpected. He woke up, took his bath, and went down to the dining table to eat with his family. He then waited for his children to leave for school. As at that time, Patricia was 16 years, Frederick, the youngest son, was 13 years, while John Jr., the eldest son, was 15 years old. When he was sure that they had left home for school, he quickly went to his garage and took out his 9mm semi-automatic handgun, which was a souvenir during his time at war. And he also took out his father's Colt .22 revolver to put into action what he had planned would be a solution to his problems and financial difficulties. John went into the kitchen where his wife Helen was sitting in front of the window and was having her morning coffee, pointed the gun in the back of her head, and shot her to death at point-blank range. He then climbed the stairs to the third floor of the house, where she saw her mother having her breakfast. Her mother asked her about the noise she heard from the kitchen, and John told her that he wasn't sure where it came from, and that was the reason he came up to check up on her. John would later go on to shoot her while she was still in bed, above her left eye. He then waited for the children to arrive home from school in the afternoon. Patricia arrived first, followed by Frederick. Both were shot in the back of the head as they made their way inside the house, with John behind them. John then proceeded to make himself a sandwich for lunch, drove to the bank, and then emptied his accounts and that of his mother, whom he had just killed. After that, he made his way to the high school, where he watched his eldest son John Jr. play in a soccer match, and then brought him home when his game was finally over. As John Lees placed the gun to shoot John Jr., John Jr. initially managed to fight back. He fought against his father but soon fell to the floor after his father, who was with the gun, overpowered him. He was the only member of the Lees family that had the slightest opportunity to fight back against his father's execution, and did so. For fighting back and still being alive after some couple of shots, he was shot multiple times in the chest and also in the face. John Lees, the father, kept firing until he was certain that the boy was dead. When he saw his eldest son was dead, he began to clean up after himself. He collected sleeping bags that were used for Boy Scout excursions with his sons and laid them out in the ballroom of the mansion. A ballroom, also known as a ball hall, is a large room inside a building with the purpose of being used to hold formal occasions or events such as dances, parties, and ceremonies. So John brought the bodies one after the other and laid them out on top. John went back up to the third floor where he had shot his mother Alma. He dragged her out from the bed to the floor and out of the room, but stopped right in the hallway outside her apartment and left her there. This was because she was too heavy for John to move down to the ballroom from the third floor of the house, and this he indicated in his confession notes, which were later found by the police. He then proceeded to cover their faces and attended to the blood which was spilled all over the floor of the ballroom and that of the hallway. After that, he cancelled all deliveries, wrote notes to the children's school stating that they would be away visiting a sick relative. He then switched on all the lights and turned on a religious music that he believed was suitable to issue his family's souls to heaven. Wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor regarding the murders. He then proceeded to pray for them and then locked the doors in the house and left from Westfield, New Jersey to Michigan and then to Denver, Colorado, where he took the name of Robert Peter Clark, remarried, and lived his new life. He was not seen again for 18 years. After the case grew incredibly cold and it seemed as though it had no chance of ever being solved, the police department would call the newspaper every year on the anniversary of the deaths and press them to rerun the story in order to keep the case fresh and alive. They did this relentlessly until another idea hit them, and this was when the show was broadcasted on America's Most Wanted. Here is a picture of how close Frank Bender was to perfect in getting John Lees boss for the show and for people to help identify him. Now, to why this happened. When questioned as to why this was the direction he took things, John would say he did what he did as a result of the financial challenges he had after his job loss as his primary motivation for murdering his entire family. John also said that he felt his family was pulled away from God and may leave the church. He also said he was not pleased with his daughter's determination to go into acting. He also stated another reason being that his wife became alcoholic and suffered from tertiary syphilis that she had hidden from him. Helen, his wife, had contracted the disease during her first marriage and persuaded John to marry in Maryland, where a blood test wasn't required to obtain a marriage license. And also, his wife's drinking problems came with lots of bickering and nagging attitude. Eventually, John's trial would begin on April 2nd, 1990 in New Jersey Superior Court. Meanwhile, his defense lawyer Elijah Miller would counter that John List only committed the murders due to his diminished mental state caused by his obsessive-compulsive personality disorder and should be found guilty of a less serious charge of second-degree murder. The prosecutor Eleanor Clark would argue that even though John had been diagnosed of an obsessive-compulsive disorder, he knew what he was doing and how he was going to do it, as his intentions were clear when he deliberately committed the crime of murdering his entire family. On April 11, 1990, which was 9 days after his trial began, it was concluded and eventually he would be found guilty and was convicted of all 5 counts of first-degree murder on April 12, 1991, and was sentenced to life in prison. He was sentenced to 5 life terms to be served consecutively, which by law automatically made him ineligible for parole for almost 75 years. On May 1st, which was 3 weeks after he was found guilty, a sentence hearing was held for John List, and he appealed on the grounds that he suffered PTSD from his military service. However, the appeal was denied. He would also argue that the 5-page letter which he wrote and confessed to killing his family was meant for only his pastor to read, and therefore not admissible for use as evidence against him. Both appeals would be rejected by the Federal Appeals Court. In 2002, John would later express some remorse for his actions, stating that he wished he had never done what he did, and that he did regret his actions and have prayed for forgiveness ever since. When asked why he didn't commit suicide himself, he responded that he believed that suicide would be a sin and would have prevented him from going to heaven, where he hoped to reunite with his family one day after he dies. John List would later die while in prison on March 21st, 2008, due to complications from pneumonia. He died at the age of 82 years. In the end, it was believed that the mass murder of John's family could have been entirely avoided if only he knew that within the mansion, just above the very ballroom that John left the remains of his entire family, were the solution to his problems or his very salvation. This was because the ballroom had a very unique feature, and that was a signed Tiffany ceiling worth approximately $100,000 as of then. This is roughly equivalent in present day to a value of $650,000. In this area image, you can see the entire house, including the ballroom ceiling. It is the only surviving image of it because of what happened just a year later after the murder. This was because in 1972, Brisnell Mansion burned down from a fire. It was thought to be arson, but no suspects were identified, and this came to be an interesting end for a very dark crime. So that would do it, guys. So what do you think about this dark crime that has been committed by John List? Do you think this crime could have been avoided? Do you think he was just a mass murderer? who killed his family because of financial difficulties, or someone who killed his family because of his strong faith as a Lutheran? I would really like to know your opinions at the comment section. If you love this story, I've also left more interesting stories which I've left